The mountain wind howled through the pines as Sharon Clark pressed her trembling fingers against the rough-hewn cabin door. Her scarred face turned away from the lamplight that spilled through the frosted window. Inside, she could hear the low rumble of men's voices, the scrape of chairs against wooden floors, and the clink of coins being counted. Her stomach twisted with a familiar dread as she recognized the tone, the same dismissive murmur that had followed her through 3 towns, 3 failed attempts at finding someone, anyone who might overlook the twisted flesh that mapped the left side of her face like a grotesque geography of pain. "She ain't what we ordered," came a gruff voice from within, and Sharon's heart sank further into the cold hollow of her chest. "Look at her. Half her face looks like it got caught in a threshing machine." Through the window, she glimpsed the silhouettes of the men who had gathered to inspect her like livestock at auction. Mail-order brides were commodities here in the Colorado Territory, and damaged goods didn't fetch much interest. She had known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like a storm front across the mountains, but the reality of it still cut deeper than the flames that had originally marked her. "The advertisement said nothing about deformities," another voice added, this one higher, more nasal. "We paid good money for a healthy woman who could work and bear children. This one's probably barren too, marked by God's displeasure." Sharon closed her eyes against the familiar sting of tears. She had traveled over 1,000 miles from Ohio, carrying nothing but a carpet bag, and the desperate hope that distance might somehow transform her into someone worthy of love, or at least acceptance. The scar tissue pulled tight across her cheek as she fought to maintain composure, the phantom pain of old wounds awakening in the mountain cold. The door suddenly swung open, and a portly man with thinning hair and suspicious eyes stepped onto the porch. Behind him, 3 other men crowded in the doorway, their faces illuminated by the amber glow of kerosene lamps. Sharon instinctively turned her unmarked profile toward them, a practiced movement born from months of shame and rejection. "Miss Clark," the portly man said, his voice carrying the weight of finality, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. The arrangement we discussed through correspondence, well, it appears certain details were omitted." Sharon's voice caught in her throat, but she managed to whisper, "I never lied in my letters, Mr. Thompson. I told you I had been injured in a fire." "You said you bore some scars," Thompson replied, his tone growing colder. "You didn't mention that half your face was melted like candle wax." The words hit her like physical blows, each one designed to strip away what little dignity she had left. Sharon had grown accustomed to such cruelty over the past 2 years, but it never stopped. Hurting. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and lifted her chin with as much grace as she could muster. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll arrange passage back to Denver in the morning." "Now hold on there." The voice came from the shadows beyond the porch, deep and measured, carrying an authority that made the other men step aside. Sharon looked up to see a figure emerging from the darkness, a tall man with broad shoulders and weathered hands, his face partially obscured by the brim of a worn hat. Unlike the others, he didn't recoil when his eyes found her scars. "Ryan Lee, T," Thompson said with obvious nervousness. "Didn't expect to see you down from your claim tonight." The mountain man stepped into the circle of lamplight, and Sharon got her first clear look at him. His face was angular and stern, marked by years of harsh weather and harder living. A thick beard covered his jaw, and his dark eyes held a depth that spoke of solitude and careful observation. He was older than the other men, perhaps in his 30s, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. "Heard there was some commotion," Ryan said simply, his gaze moving from Thompson to Sharon. "Figured I'd see what all the fuss was about. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Just a business matter, Lee. Nothing that concerns you." "Maybe not," Ryan agreed, but his eyes remained fixed on Sharon. "Miss, you got somewhere to stay tonight?" The question caught her off guard. In all her travels, no one had bothered to ask about her welfare after rejecting her. Sharon shook her head slowly, not trusting her voice. "Hotel's full up," Thompson said quickly. "And frankly, we can't have her wandering around town. Bad for business, if you understand my meaning." Ryan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I understand plenty," he said, and something in his tone made Thompson take a step back. "Miss Clark, is it? You're welcome to shelter at my cabin tonight. Storm's coming in, and it's no weather for traveling. Sharon stared at him in disbelief. I, I couldn't impose, Mr. Lee. You don't even know me. Know enough, Ryan replied. Know you've traveled a long way and deserve better treatment than you're getting here. The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Sharon couldn't fully grasp. She had learned to be wary of men's kindness, particularly when it came unexpectedly, but something in Ryan Lee's manner suggested sincerity rather than ulterior motives. His offer wasn't accompanied by the leering glances or calculating expressions she had grown accustomed to. That's very kind, she said carefully, but I wouldn't want to be a burden. No burden, Ryan said simply. Got plenty of room, and it's Christian decent to offer shelter to a stranger. Thompson cleared his throat loudly. Now see here, Lee. This woman came here under false pretenses. We have every right to... To what? Ryan's voice cut through the night air like a blade. Turn a woman out in the cold because she doesn't meet your particular standards of beauty? That the kind of men you've come, Thompson? The challenge in his words was unmistakable, and Sharon watched as the other men shuffled uncomfortably. Thompson's face reddened, but he seemed unwilling to push the confrontation further with Ryan Lee. Her appearance ain't the only concern, one of the other men spoke up. Woman with scars like that? It's a sign. Means she's been touched by misfortune. Could bring bad luck to whoever takes her in. Ryan turned his attention to the speaker, a thin man with nervous eyes and fidgeting hands. That's so, Perkins? Then I reckon I've had enough bad luck in my time that a little more won't make much difference. The statement carried a weight of personal history that silenced the group. Sharon found herself studying Ryan's profile in the lamplight, wondering what sorrows had shaped him into the kind of man who would defend a stranger against a crowd. The offer stands, Ryan said to Sharon, but it's your choice to make. Sharon looked around at the hostile faces surrounding her, then back at Ryan Lee. She had few options and fewer allies. The stage back to Denver wouldn't leave until the following afternoon, assuming she could afford passage, and spending the night exposed to the elements seemed increasingly dangerous as the wind picked up strength. I accept, she said quietly. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Lee. Ryan nodded once and moved to collect her carpet bag from where she had set it beside the door. As he lifted it, Sharon noticed the careful way he handled her belongings, as if they were valuable rather than the meager possessions of a desperate woman. My horse is tied up behind the mercantile, he said. It's not far, but the path's rough in the dark. I can manage, Sharon replied, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. The day's travel had left her exhausted, and the emotional weight of another rejection had drained what little strength remained. As they prepared to leave, Thompson called out one final time, Lee, you sure you want to get mixed up in this? Woman like that? She's nothing but trouble. Ryan paused in his stride and turned back toward the group. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that brooked no argument. Seems to me the trouble's coming from folks who've forgotten how to treat another human being with basic decency, he said. Miss Clark hasn't done anything but show up looking for a chance at a new life. That's more courage than most of us have shown in years. With that, he gestured for Sharon to follow him into the darkness beyond the porch light. As they walked away from the cabin, Sharon could hear the men behind them muttering among themselves, their voices carrying notes of confusion and resentment. The path to Ryan's horse proved treacherous in the darkness, winding between stumps and boulders that seemed to appear without warning. Sharon stumbled twice, her skirts catching on low branches, but each time Ryan's steady hand appeared at her elbow to guide her safely forward. Careful here, he murmured, as they approached a particularly steep section. Ground's loose from the recent rains. His consideration surprised her. Most men, in her experience, expected women to keep up or be left behind. Ryan Lee seemed to understand that her unfamiliarity with mountain terrain put her at a disadvantage, and he adjusted his pace accordingly. When they reached his horse, a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes and a patient disposition, Ryan helped Sharon mount before swinging up behind her. The intimate proximity should have made her uncomfortable, but instead she found his presence oddly reassuring. He smelled of wood smoke and pine sap, clean scents that spoke of honest labor and outdoor living. My cabin's about 3 miles up the mountain, Ryan said as they began to climb. Path gets narrow in places, but Sage here knows the way better than I do. The horse picked her way carefully up the winding trail, her hooves finding purchase on surfaces that seemed impossibly steep and rocky. Sharon gripped the saddle horn tightly, unused to mountain riding, while Ryan's steady presence behind her provided a sense of security she hadn't felt in months. As they climbed higher, the sounds of the town faded into the distance, replaced by the whisper of wind through evergreen branches and the soft rhythm of the horse's breathing. Stars began to appear overhead, brilliant points of light unmarred by the smoke and dust of civilization. "Beautiful night," Ryan observed quietly. Sharon tilted her head back to look up at the vast expanse of sky. "I've never seen so many stars," she admitted. "In Ohio, the sky always seems smaller somehow." "Mountain sky is different," Ryan agreed. "Makes a person feel both smaller and larger at the same time, if that makes sense." It did make sense, though Sharon couldn't quite articulate why. There was something about the immensity of the landscape that put human concerns into perspective, while simultaneously making each individual moment feel more significant. "Mr. Lee," she said after they had ridden in comfortable silence for several minutes, "why did you help me tonight?" She felt him shift slightly behind her, considering the question. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said eventually. "Those men were acting like jackals, and you deserve better." "But you don't know anything about me. I could be everything they said. Trouble, bad luck, worse." "Could be, aren't they?" Ryan acknowledged. "But I've found that people who've suffered tend to understand suffering in others. Makes them kinder. Most times, not harder." The simple wisdom in his words touched something deep in Sharon's chest, a place that had been carefully guarded for so long she had almost forgotten it existed. She had spent 2 years believing that her scars made her less than human in the eyes of others, that the fire had burned away not just her beauty, but her worth as a person. Ryan Lee's matter-of-fact acceptance of her as someone deserving of basic kindness felt like a revelation. "The fire," she said quietly, surprising herself with the admission, "it happened when I was 19, a kitchen accident that spread faster than anyone could have imagined." She felt Ryan's attention focus on her words, though he didn't interrupt or press for details. The horse continued her steady climb, and Sharon found herself continuing to speak, drawn by the darkness and the stranger's patient silence. "I was engaged to be married," she continued, "had been for 2 years, waiting for James to finish his apprenticeship so we could afford our own home. After the fire, beside him, he said he couldn't bear to look at me, said it would remind him every day of how things used to be." The memory still carried a sharp edge of pain, though time had dulled it somewhat. Sharon touched her scarred cheek unconsciously, feeling the familiar texture of damaged skin. "I'm sorry," Ryan said simply. "That must have been a hard blow on top of everything else." "It was," Sharon admitted, "but I think what hurt most was realizing that his love had been so shallow. If he could abandon me so easily, maybe what we had wasn't worth saving anyway." They crested a ridge, and suddenly the lights of Ryan's cabin appeared ahead, warm and welcoming against the dark mountainside. It was a modest structure, built from local timber with careful attention to weatherproofing and durability. Smoke rose from the chimney and lamplight glowed in the windows, creating an impression of home that made Sharon's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Here we are," Ryan said as he guided Sage toward a small stable beside the cabin. "Not much to look at, but it's warm and dry." As they dismounted, Sharon got her first close look at Ryan's property. Even in the darkness, she could see evidence of careful maintenance and thoughtful planning. A vegetable garden lay dormant for the winter, properly mulched and prepared for spring planting. Split firewood was stacked in neat rows under a covered shelter. Tools hung in organized rows inside the stable, clean and well-maintained. "You live here alone?" Sharon asked as Ryan tended to his horse. "Mostly," he replied, rubbing Sage down with practiced efficiency. "Get visitors from time to time. Trappers, prospectors, folks passing through. But yeah, it's generally just me and the mountain." Sharon wondered what had driven him to such solitude. In her experience, men who chose isolation usually had reasons that went deeper than simple preference for privacy. But she had no right to pry, particularly when he had shown her such unexpected kindness. Ryan finished with the horse and collected Sharon's carpet bag, then led her toward the cabin's front door. As they approached, Sharon noticed details that spoke of a man who took pride in his home despite its remote location. The porch was swept clean, the door frame was painted and well-maintained, and curtains hung in the windows, small touches that suggested comfort rather than mere survival. Inside, the cabin proved even more welcoming than its exterior had promised. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books and simple furnishings. The main room served multiple purposes: kitchen, dining area, and sitting room. But everything was arranged with an eye for both function and comfort. Coffee? Ryan offered, moving toward the stove where a pot sat warming. Or tea, if you prefer. Got some chamomile that's good for settling nerves. Coffee would be wonderful, Sharon replied, settling gratefully into a chair near the fire. The warmth felt like a blessing after the cold mountain air, and she found herself relaxing for the first time in days. Ryan moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, preparing 2 cups of coffee and setting out a plate of simple food: bread, cheese, and preserved meat. His movements were economical and precise, suggesting years of bachelor living, but there was nothing rough or careless about his hospitality. "You must think I'm terribly foolish," Sharon said as he handed her a steaming mug. "Traveling all this way to marry a man I'd never met, based on nothing but letters." Ryan settled into the chair across from her, his own coffee cradled in hands that bore the calluses of hard work. "Don't think that at all," he said. "Takes considerable courage to leave everything familiar and start over somewhere new. Most folks never manage it, even when they should." "Even when they should," Sharon repeated thoughtfully. "You sound like you speak from experience." Ryan's eyes took on a distant quality, as if he were looking at something far beyond the cabin walls. "Came out here about 5 years ago," he said after a moment. "Had my own reasons for wanting a fresh start." Sharon waited, sensing there was more to the story, but Ryan seemed disinclined to elaborate. Instead, he rose and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room, returning with a thick blanket and a pillow. "You can have the bed," he said, nodding toward a door that presumably led to the cabin's single bedroom. "I'll make do out here by the fire." Oh no," Sharon protested immediately. "I couldn't take your bed. The chair will be perfectly adequate for me." "Won't hear of it," Ryan said firmly. "You're a guest in my home, and guests get the bed. Besides, I've spent plenty of nights by the fire. Won't be any hardship." The kindness in his gesture overwhelmed Sharon's carefully maintained composure. After months of rejection and cruelty, Ryan Lee's simple decency felt almost too good to be true. She blinked back tears that threatened to spill over, not wanting to embarrass herself further. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, "for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't intervened tonight." "Don't mention it," Ryan replied, but his voice carried a gentleness that belied his gruff exterior. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." As Sharon prepared for bed in the small but comfortable bedroom, she found herself wondering about the man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. Ryan Lee was unlike anyone she had encountered in her travels, neither the crude opportunist who saw mail-order brides as convenient labor, nor the supposedly refined gentleman who couldn't hide their revulsion at her appearance. The bed was simple but comfortable, with clean sheets that smelled of mountain air and soap. As Sharon settled under the quilts, she could hear Ryan moving quietly around the main room, banking the fire and preparing his makeshift bed. The sounds were oddly comforting, reminding her of childhood nights when her father's presence in the house had made the world feel safe and predictable. Through the thin walls, she could hear the wind picking up outside, whistling through the pines with increasing intensity. The storm Ryan had predicted was arriving, and Sharon felt a deep gratitude for the warm shelter and the unexpected kindness of her host. Without his intervention, she would have been spending this night in whatever cold corner she could find, counting her remaining coins and wondering how she would manage the journey back to a life that held no more promise than the one she had tried to leave behind. Sleep came slowly, her mind churning with questions about what the morning would bring. The stage to Denver wouldn't leave until afternoon, assuming the weather cooperated, but Sharon found herself reluctant to think about returning to Ohio. Going back would mean admitting defeat, acknowledging that her scars had indeed made her unmarriageable and unwanted. But staying seemed equally impossible. She had no money, no prospects, and no reason to believe that Colorado territory held any more opportunities than the places she had already tried. As she drifted towards sleep, Sharon found herself thinking about Ryan Lee's hands, strong and capable, but gentle when he had helped her from the horse. In the lamplight, she had noticed old scars across his knuckles, the kind that came from hard work and harder living. Yet those same hands had handled her belongings with care and offered her coffee with a courtesy that had nothing to do with her appearance or her circumstances. The wind continued to howl outside, but within the cabin's walls, Sharon felt safer than she had in months. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with more strength than she had possessed that morning. Sometimes, she reflected drowsily, salvation came in the most unexpected forms. Morning arrived with the sound of splitting wood and the aroma of coffee brewing. Sharon woke slowly, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar surroundings before memory returned. Pale sunlight filtered through the bedroom window, revealing that the predicted storm had indeed arrived during the night. Snow covered the ground outside, and the wind still carried a bitter edge that spoke of more weather to come. She dressed quickly and emerged from the bedroom to find Ryan already up and about, tending the fire and preparing what appeared to be a substantial breakfast. He looked up as she entered, offering a brief nod of greeting. "Morning, brah," he said simply. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Sharon admitted, settling into the chair she had occupied the night before. "Thank you again for your hospitality." Ryan waved it off her thanks and poured coffee into a fresh mug, setting it beside her along with a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. The meal was simple but expertly prepared, and Sharon realized she hadn't eaten a proper breakfast in days. "Storm hit pretty hard," Ryan observed, glancing toward the window. "Road down to town's probably impassable for a few days." Sharon's heart sank. If the stage couldn't run, she would be stranded with no way to pay for extended lodging and no clear plan for what came next. Her financial resources were nearly exhausted, and the prospect of being trapped in a hostile town filled her with dread. "I see," she said quietly, trying to keep the despair from her voice. "I suppose I'll have to wait it out somehow." Ryan studied her face for a moment, and Sharon instinctively turned her scarred cheek away from his gaze. But instead of the revulsion or pity she expected, his expression remained thoughtful and calm. "Could stay here until the road's clear," he suggested. "Got plenty of space, and the company wouldn't be unwelcome." The offer caught Sharon completely off guard. "Mr. Lee, I couldn't possibly impose on your hospitality any longer. You've already done more than enough." "Wouldn't be imposing," Ryan replied matter-of-factly. "Truth is, I could use some help around here. Winter's the hardest time for managing everything alone, and I've got projects that would go easier with an extra pair of hands." Sharon looked around the cabin, noting its immaculate condition and obvious functionality. "You seem to manage quite well on your own." "Manage, yes," Ryan acknowledged, "but there's a difference between surviving and living well. Haven't had much call for the finer touches that make a place feel like home." The comment surprised Sharon. She had assumed that Ryan Lee was content with his solitary existence, that he had chosen isolation as a permanent way of life. But his words suggested a loneliness he might not even fully acknowledge to himself. "What kind of help?" she asked cautiously. Ryan gestured toward the kitchen area. "Cooking, for one thing. I can make basic meals, but I'm no hand at baking or preserving. Garden planting for spring, mending, sewing. My clothes could use attention from someone who knows what they're doing." As he spoke, Sharon noticed details that supported his assessment. His shirt, while clean, bore careful patches that spoke of necessity rather than skill. The kitchen, though functional, lacked the organizational touches that could make meal preparation more efficient. These were tasks she could handle easily, domestic skills that had been deemed worthless in the marriage market, but might have real value in this remote setting. "I could do those things," she said slowly, "but I have no money to pay for room and board." "Wouldn't expect payment," Ryan replied. "Fair exchange of labor for shelter and food. If you're willing to work, that's payment enough." The arrangement he proposed was unlike anything Sharon had encountered in her travels. Most offers of employment for women came with expectations that extended far beyond domestic labor, and she had learned to be wary of men who seemed too eager to help. But Ryan's proposal felt different, practical rather than predatory, based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. "You don't know anything about my character," Sharon pointed out. "I could be lazy, dishonest, completely incompetent at household tasks." Ryan's mouth quirked upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Could be, he agreed, but somehow I doubt it. Woman who has the courage to travel 1,000 miles to start over probably has the backbone to work hard when given this chance. His faith in her abilities, stated so matter-of-factly, stirred something in Sharon that had been dormant for too long. She had grown accustomed to being judged solely on her appearance, to having her worth as a person dismissed before anyone bothered to discover what she might contribute. Ryan Lee seemed willing to evaluate her based on her actions rather than her scars, and the novelty of that approach was almost overwhelming. The arrangement would be temporary, she said carefully, just until the weather clears and I can make other plans. Of course, Ryan agreed, though something in his tone suggested he might not be entirely opposed to a longer arrangement. No obligations beyond what we both agree to. Sharon considered the offer while finishing her breakfast. The alternative was returning to town and hoping for charity from people who had already made their feelings about her clear. Even if she could find temporary shelter, her resources would run out within days, leaving her in an even more desperate situation. All right, she said finally. I accept your offer, Mr. Lee, but I insist on earning my keep. I won't be a burden on your generosity. Wouldn't expect anything less, Ryan replied. And you might as well call me Ryan. If we're going to be sharing a roof, formal address seems unnecessary. The use of his first name felt strange on her tongue, but Sharon nodded her agreement. Sharon, she offered in return. Sharon Ryan. Repeated, and something in the way he said her name without hesitation or discomfort made her realize that he was the first person in months to use it without an accompanying wince or sideways glance. With the immediate question of her accommodation settled, Sharon found herself looking around the cabin with new eyes. If she was going to be staying here, even temporarily, she wanted to understand how the household functioned and where she might make useful contributions. Would you show me around? She asked. Help me understand how things work here? Ryan nodded and rose from his chair, beginning what turned into an extensive tour of his property. The cabin itself was larger than it had appeared from outside, with the main room, bedroom, a small storage area, and a root cellar that stayed cool year-round. Behind the cabin, Ryan had built a workshop where he crafted furniture and tools, both for his own use and occasionally for trade with townspeople. Carpentry was my trade before I came here, he explained as they examined his collection of well-maintained tools. Still do some work for folks who need it, though most of my time goes to maintaining this place. Sharon ran her fingers along the smooth surface of a half-finished table, admiring the quality of the craftsmanship. You're very skilled, she observed. This is beautiful work. Keeps my hands busy, Ryan replied, but she could see that her appreciation pleased him. Always found working with wood more satisfying than most other occupations. They moved on to the garden area, now dormant under snow, but clearly well-planned and carefully maintained. Ryan explained his rotation system, the challenges of mountain growing seasons, and his methods for preserving the harvest through the long winters. Never had much luck with flowers, he admitted, as they stood looking at the neat rows of buried vegetable beds. Seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford to worry about. Flowers aren't just luxury, Sharon said without thinking. They feed something in the soul that vegetables can't touch. Ryan looked at her with interest. You know about gardening? Some, Sharon replied. My mother kept extensive flower gardens when I was young. I helped her from the time I could walk. After she died, I maintained them myself until... She gestured vaguely at her scarred face. Until the fire, Ryan finished gently. Until the fire, Sharon agreed. After that, James's family thought it was inappropriate for me to be seen working outdoors. Said my appearance might disturb the neighbors. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. She had thought she had made peace with those memories, but speaking them aloud brought back the full weight of the isolation and shame that had followed her injury. Their loss, Ryan said simply. Anyone who judges a person's worth by their appearance is missing what really matters. His words were stated as fact rather than comfort, and Sharon found them more convincing than any of the well-meaning platitudes she had received from others. Ryan Lee seemed to possess an unshakable certainty about what constituted true value in a person, and his assessment apparently didn't depend on conventional standards of beauty. As they completed their tour of the property, Sharon began to see opportunities for the kind of contributions Ryan had mentioned. The cabin was functional but sterile, lacking the smallest touches that transformed a shelter into a home. His clothes were clean but poorly mended, and his meals, while adequate, showed little imagination or variety. These were problems she could solve, tasks that would give her purpose and justify her presence here. "When would you like me to start?" she asked, as they returned to the warmth of the cabin. "No time like the present," Ryan replied. "But first, let's get you properly settled. Can't have you living out of a carpet bag indefinitely." He led her to the bedroom and opened a large wardrobe that had been standing empty. "You can use this for your things," he said, "and there's a chest of drawers that's not being used." As Sharon unpacked her meager belongings, she was acutely aware of how little she had brought with her. A few dresses, basic undergarments, a single pair of good shoes, and the small collection of personal items she hadn't been able to bear leaving behind. Her mother's sewing kit, a book of poetry, and a daguerreotype of her parents taken shortly after their marriage. Ryan noticed the photograph as she placed it carefully on the chest of drawers. "Your parents?" he asked. Sharon, he asked. "Yes," Sharon replied, touching the frame gently. "Taken in 1845, just after they were married. Mother died when I was 16, and father followed 2 years later. Must have been hard, losing them so young." "It was," Sharon admitted, "but they had a good marriage, full of love and respect. They taught me what to look for in a partnership, even if I haven't been very successful at finding it." Ryan studied the photograph for a moment, and Sharon noticed that his attention seemed focused on her parents' faces rather than making comparisons to her own appearance. "They look happy," he observed. "They were," Sharon said. "Even when times were difficult, they faced things together. I used to think that kind of love was common, that most people found it eventually." "Maybe they do," Ryan said quietly. "Maybe it just takes longer for some folks to recognize it when it appears." There was something in his tone that made Sharon look at him more closely, but Ryan had already turned away and was moving toward the main room. She finished unpacking in thoughtful silence, wondering what experiences had shaped his perspective on love and partnership. When she rejoined him, Ryan was examining a pile of mending that had been stacked in a corner. "If you're serious about earning your keep," he said, "this would be a good place to start. I'm afraid I'm better at tearing clothes than fixing them." Sharon accepted the bundle of garments and settled into her chair by the fire, spreading the first item across her lap. It was a work shirt with a torn sleeve, the kind of damage that came from catching on sharp branches or rough surfaces. The fabric was good quality but showed signs of repeated amateur repairs. "May I use your mother's sewing kit?" Ryan asked, noticing her examining the shirt. "Of course," Sharon replied, touched that he had remembered the small detail. She would have wanted it to be useful. As she began to work, carefully removing Ryan's clumsy stitches and preparing to redo the repair properly, Sharon found herself settling into a rhythm that felt both familiar and comforting. The precise movements required for fine needlework had always calmed her mind, and the satisfaction of restoring damaged items to usefulness gave her a sense of purpose she had been missing. Ryan busied himself with his own tasks, occasionally adding wood to the fire or checking on something in the kitchen, but mostly he left her to work in peaceful silence. The quiet between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, as if they had already established a rhythm of coexistence that didn't require constant conversation. "You're very skilled," Ryan observed after watching her work for several minutes. "That tear looked beyond saving, but you're making it disappear completely." "Practice," Sharon replied, not looking up from her stitching. "I've been mending clothes since I was old enough to hold a needle safely." Mother believed that taking care of what you have is as important as acquiring new things. "Wise woman," Ryan said. "Wish more people understood that principle." As the morning progressed, Sharon found herself relaxing more completely than she had in months. The combination of useful work, warm shelter, and Ryan's undemanding presence created an atmosphere of peace that she had almost forgotten was possible. For the first time since leaving Ohio, she wasn't constantly braced for rejection or cruelty. "Tell me about your carpentry," she said as she moved on to the second garment in the pile. "What drew you to that trade?" Ryan settled into the chair across from her, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "Started when I was 12, he said. "My father apprenticed me to a cabinet maker in town. Figured it was better than farming, and I seemed to have an aptitude for it." "Did you enjoy it?" "Most of the time," Ryan replied thoughtfully. "There's something satisfying about taking raw wood and shaping it into something useful and beautiful. Every piece has its own character, its own challenges. You have to work with the grain, not against it. Sharon looked up from her sewing, struck by something in his tone. Sounds like you're talking about more than just wood. Ryan met her gaze directly, and for a moment Sharon forgot to be self-conscious about her scars. Maybe I am, he said. People aren't so different from wood in some ways. Everyone has their own grain, their own natural strengths and weaknesses. Try to force them into shapes that don't suit their nature, and you'll end up with something that breaks under pressure. The observation was more philosophical than Sharon had expected from a mountain hermit, and it made her curious about what had driven him to seek solitude. Is that why you left your old life behind? She asked gently. Ryan was quiet for so long that Sharon thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that she recognized from her own experience. I was married once, he said simply. Had a good business, a house in town, everything that was supposed to make a man successful and happy. Sharon waited, sensing there was more to the story. My wife, Catherine, she died in childbirth. Lost the baby too. Ryan's hands tightened around his coffee mug. After that, nothing felt the same. The business, the house, the whole life we'd built together, it all felt empty without her. I'm sorry, Sharon said quietly. That must have been devastating. It was, Ryan acknowledged, but the worst part came after. People kept telling me I was young, that I'd find someone else, start over, as if Catherine was replaceable, as if what we'd had together was just convenient. Sharon understood the pain in his voice. She had heard similar comments about her own situation. Well-meaning friends suggesting that her scars didn't matter because she could always find someone desperate enough to overlook them. So you came here, she said. So I came here, Ryan confirmed. Figured if I was going to be alone, I might as well be alone on my own terms, in a place where the solitude felt chosen rather than imposed. The honesty of his confession moved Sharon deeply. Like her, Ryan Lee had been wounded by life's cruelties and had sought refuge in distance and isolation. But unlike her, he had found a way to build something meaningful from his solitude, creating a home and a life that reflected his values rather than other people's expectations. Do you ever regret it, she asked, leaving everything behind? Ryan considered the question carefully. Sometimes, he admitted, especially in winter, when the isolation feels heavier. But I've never regretted refusing to pretend that what I'd lost didn't matter, or that I could just replace it with something else. His words resonated with Sharon's own experience. She had spent 2 years trying to convince herself that she could find happiness by accepting whatever scraps of affection might be offered to someone with her limitations. Ryan's choice to honor his grief rather than rush past it seemed both braver and more honest. Thank you for telling me, she said. It helps to know that someone else understands what it's like to have your life completely changed by circumstances beyond your control. We all carry scars, Ryan replied, his eyes meeting hers without flinching. Some are just more visible than others. The simple statement hit Sharon with unexpected force. In all her months of traveling and being rejected, no one had ever acknowledged that her visible scars might not be the only wounds that mattered. Ryan's recognition of the deeper damage, the emotional and spiritual injuries that couldn't be seen, made her feel understood in a way she hadn't experienced since before the fire. As the afternoon wore on, Sharon continued her mending while Ryan worked on various maintenance tasks around the cabin. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, but the enforced isolation felt less like a trap and more like a reprieve from the harsh judgments of the outside world. When evening approached, Sharon insisted on preparing dinner, eager to demonstrate her usefulness in the kitchen. She found Ryan's pantry well-stocked with basic staples, and his root cellar contained preserved vegetables and meat that could be transformed into a substantial meal. Smells good, Ryan observed as she worked at the stove. Been a long time since this place had the aroma of real cooking. I hope you'll find it satisfactory, Sharon replied, stirring a pot of stew that was beginning to thicken properly. I'm afraid my repertoire is somewhat limited, but I can make basic meals more interesting with the right seasonings. Anything's an improvement over what I've been managing, Ryan said with what Sharon was beginning to recognize as his version of humor, dry and understated, but genuine. As they sat down to eat, Sharon found herself studying Ryan's face in the lamplight. The harsh angles she had noticed the night before seemed softer now, and she could see intelligence and kindness in his dark eyes. His hands, scarred from years of hard work, held his fork with surprising delicacy, and his table manners spoke of a upbringing that had included attention to social graces. "This is excellent," Ryan said after tasting the stew. "You weren't exaggerating about your cooking skills." "Thank you," Sharon replied, pleased by his approval. "It's nice to cook for someone who appreciates it. I'd almost forgotten how satisfying that could be." As they ate, conversation flowed more easily than it had since Sharon's arrival. Ryan asked about her journey west, and she found herself describing the various towns and people she had encountered with more humor and less bitterness than she had expected. In return, Ryan told her about life in the mountains, the challenges and rewards of self-sufficiency, and the occasional visitors who brought news from the outside world. "Do you ever get lonely?" Sharon asked as they finished their meal. "Sometimes," Ryan admitted, "but I've learned to distinguish between being alone and being lonely. They're not the same thing." "No," Sharon agreed thoughtfully. "I was surrounded by people in Ohio, but I felt lonelier than I ever have in my life. People who don't really see you don't provide much company," Ryan observed. The truth of that statement settled over Sharon like a revelation. For months, she had blamed her isolation on her scars, assuming that her appearance made meaningful connection impossible. But Ryan's insight suggested that the problem might have been more fundamental, that she had been seeking acceptance from people who were incapable of seeing past surface appearances to recognize her true worth. After dinner, Sharon insisted on cleaning up while Ryan tended to the fire. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, a habit she had abandoned after the fire, but which seemed to be returning naturally in this peaceful environment. "Pretty tune," Ryan commented from his chair by the fireplace. "What is it?" Sharon blushed, realizing she had been humming aloud. "Just something my mother used to sing while she worked in the garden. I haven't thought about it in years." "She sounds like she was a special woman." "She was," Sharon agreed, drying the last of the dishes. "She had a way of finding beauty in everyday things, of making ordinary moments feel special." "Sounds like a gift worth inheriting," Ryan said quietly. Sharon joined him by the fire, settling into her chair with a piece of mending. The evening stretched ahead of them, peaceful and unhurried, and for the first time in months, Sharon felt no anxiety about what tomorrow might bring. "Ryan," she said after they had sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Last night when you saw me for the first time, you didn't react the way most people do. You didn't stare, or look away quickly, or make any of the usual expressions of pity or revulsion. How did you manage that?" Ryan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a thoughtfulness that suggested he had been considering the question himself. "I suppose because I was looking at you, not just your scars," he said. "When I see a person, I try to look for what makes them who they are, their character, their spirit, the way they carry themselves. Physical appearance is just the surface of things. Most people seem to find it difficult to see past the surface." "Most people are afraid," Ryan replied. "Scars remind them that life can change in an instant, that the things they take for granted, health, beauty, security, can disappear without warning. It's easier to look away than to acknowledge that vulnerability." Sharon had never considered that perspective before. She had assumed that people's reactions to her scars were based on aesthetic revulsion or superstitious fears about bad luck. Ryan's suggestion that their discomfort might stem from a deeper anxiety about life's unpredictability made their behavior seem less personal and more understandable. "You don't seem to share that fear," she observed. "I've already lost everything I thought was permanent," Ryan said simply. "Scars don't frighten me because I know that the worst things in life often leave no visible marks at all." His words carried such quiet conviction that Sharon found herself seeing her own situation from a completely new angle. For 2 years, she had defined herself by her scars, allowing them to become the central fact of her identity. But Ryan's perspective suggested that her visible wounds might actually be less significant than the invisible damage she had sustained from rejection and isolation. "I've been thinking about my scars all wrong," she said slowly, "treating them as if they were the most important thing about me." "Are they?" Ryan asked gently. Sharon considered the question seriously. Her scars were certainly noticeable, and they had undeniably affected the course of her life. But were they really the most significant aspect of who she was as a person? No, she said finally. They're part of my history, but they don't define my character or my capabilities. Then why let other people's reactions to them determine your worth? The question was asked without judgment, but it cut straight to the heart of Sharon's struggle. She had allowed other people's shallow assessments to convince her that she was damaged goods, unmarriageable and unworthy of love. In doing so, she had abandoned her own sense of self-worth and accepted a diminished version of what her life could be. Because it was easier than fighting, she admitted. Easier than insisting on my own value when everyone else seemed determined to deny it. Fighting's hard, Ryan agreed, but surrendering to other people's limitations is harder in the long run. As the fire burned lower, Sharon found herself thinking about the woman she had been before the fire. Confident, optimistic, secure in her worth and her future. That woman hadn't disappeared in the flames. She had simply been buried under layers of shame and fear. Perhaps it was time to stop mourning her loss and start working to reclaim her. I used to be different, she said quietly. Before the fire, I mean. Stronger, more sure of myself. You're still strong, Ryan replied. Takes considerable strength to travel 1,000 miles looking for a new life. Most people would have given up long before that. It doesn't feel like strength, it feels like desperation. Sometimes they're the same thing, Ryan observed. Sometimes desperation is what gives us the courage to do what we never thought we could manage. Sharon looked at him across the firelight. This man who had shown her more kindness and understanding in 2 days than she had received in 2 years of searching. His own journey from loss to solitude to whatever this new phase of his life might become had required its own form of courage. What happens when the road's clear? She asked. When I can leave if I choose to. Ryan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested the question mattered too. Him more than his casual tone would indicate. That's up to you, he said. The offer to stay stands for as long as you find it beneficial. And if I stayed permanently, what would that look like? I suppose we'd figure it out as we went along, Ryan replied. I'm not much for detailed planning these days. Seems like life has a way of changing course whether we plan for it or not. The non-answer was somehow more reassuring than a detailed proposal would have been. Sharon had grown wary of men who had elaborate plans for her future, who saw her as a solution to their problems rather than a person with her own needs and desires. Ryan's willingness to let their relationship develop naturally, without predetermined expectations, felt like a gift she hadn't known she needed. As they prepared for bed, Sharon found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been a desperate woman facing yet another rejection, convinced that her scars had made her unfit for love or partnership. Tonight, she was sharing a home with a man who saw her as a complete person worthy of respect and consideration. The change wasn't magical. Her scars hadn't disappeared, and the world outside the cabin hadn't suddenly become more accepting. But something fundamental had shifted in how she understood her own worth, and that shift felt like the beginning of a transformation that could change everything. Good night, Sharon, Ryan said as she headed toward the bedroom. Good night, Ryan, she replied, and for the first time in months, the words carried genuine anticipation for the morning to come. The next few days fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and healing. Sharon threw herself into the domestic tasks she had promised to handle, finding satisfaction in bringing order and comfort to Ryan's previously Spartan existence. She reorganized the kitchen for greater efficiency, mended not just his clothes but his linens and curtains, and began planning improvements to the cabin that would make it feel more like a home. Ryan, in turn, seemed to appreciate her contributions without taking them for granted. He thanked her for meals, complimented her organizational skills, and gradually began sharing more of his thoughts and observations. Their conversations ranged from practical matters of mountain living to deeper discussions about life, loss, and the search for meaning. On the 4th morning of Sharon's stay, she woke to find bright sunlight streaming through the bedroom window and the sound of dripping water from the eaves. The storm had finally passed, and the snow was beginning to melt. Road should be passable by tomorrow, Ryan observed over breakfast. Stage will probably run the day after that. Sharon nodded, though the prospect of leaving no longer filled her with relief. The cabin had become a sanctuary, and Ryan's companionship had reminded her of what it felt like to be valued for who she was rather than judged for what she lacked. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about your offer to stay longer." Ryan looked up from his coffee, his expression attentive but carefully neutral. "And I'd like to accept if the offer still stands, at least until spring when I can see what opportunities might be available then." Something in Ryan's posture relaxed, though his voice remained calm. "Offer stands," he said. "Be glad to have you stay." The simple acceptance of her decision felt like a victory, though Sharon couldn't quite articulate what she had won. Perhaps it was the right to choose her own path rather than having it dictated by other people's prejudices. Perhaps it was the opportunity to discover who she might become when she wasn't constantly defending her right to exist. "There is one thing we should discuss," Sharon said, gathering her courage for a conversation she had been avoiding. "The sleeping arrangements. I can't continue taking your bed indefinitely." Ryan's jaw tightened slightly. "Told you before, guests get the bed. But I'm not a guest anymore, am I? If I'm staying through the spring, I'm something more like a partner in the household, I mean." The word partner seemed to hang in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Sharon felt her cheeks warm, but she pressed on. "What I mean is, we should share the space more equitably. I could sleep in the main room sometimes, or we could take turns, or we could share the bedroom," Ryan said quietly. The suggestion hit Sharon like a physical shock. She had been thinking in terms of practical arrangements, but Ryan's words carried a weight that went far beyond logistics. Sharing a bedroom would mean crossing a line they had been carefully avoiding, moving from companionship into territory that was both more intimate and more complicated. "I, that is," Sharon found herself stammering, unsure how to respond. The idea wasn't unwelcome exactly, but it represented a level of trust and vulnerability that frightened her. "Just a practical suggestion," Ryan said, though his eyes suggested it was more than that. "Room's large enough for 2 beds, and it makes more sense than one of us sleeping by the fire every night." "2 beds," Sharon repeated, latching onto the practical aspect of the proposal. "That would be more sensible." "I could build a second bed easily enough," Ryan continued. "Good use of some lumber I've been saving." The conversation felt charged with undercurrents that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge openly. Sharon found herself studying Ryan's face, looking for clues about his true feelings while trying to understand her own. "That would be acceptable," she said finally, "if you're certain it wouldn't be an imposition." "No imposition," Ryan replied, but something in his tone suggested that sharing the bedroom would be significant for him as well. As the day progressed, Sharon found herself thinking about the implications of their new arrangement. Sharing a bedroom, even with separate beds, would mean a level of intimacy she hadn't experienced since before her injury. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. That afternoon, Ryan began work on the second bed, and Sharon watched him measure and cut lumber with the same careful precision he brought to all his tasks. His movements were economical and sure, and she found herself admiring not just his skill, but the quiet confidence with which he approached every challenge. "You make it look effortless," she observed, as he fitted joints together with mathematical precision. "Practice," Ryan replied, echoing her earlier comment about sewing. "Done enough of this kind of work that my hands know what to do, even when my mind's elsewhere." "Where is your mind today?" Sharon asked, surprised by her own boldness. Ryan paused in his work and looked at her directly. "Thinking about changes," he said. "How quickly life can shift from one thing to something entirely different." "Do you mind the changes?" "No," Ryan said after a moment's consideration. "Can't say I mind them at all." The admission sent warmth spreading through Sharon's chest. She had been so focused on her own fears and uncertainties that she hadn't fully considered that Ryan might be experiencing his own complicated emotions about their evolving relationship. As evening approached, Sharon prepared another meal, this time experimenting with some of the preserved fruits she had found in the root cellar. The result was a simple but satisfying dessert that drew genuine appreciation from Ryan. "You're spoiling me," he said as he finished the last bite. "Going to be hard to go back to my usual fare after this." "You won't have to," Sharon replied. "Not as long as I'm here." The promise felt like more than a commitment to cooking. It was an acknowledgement that she was planning to stay, that she was investing in whatever this arrangement between them was becoming. After dinner, they worked together to move Sharon's belongings into the bedroom, where Ryan's new bed frame was taking shape. The process felt momentous despite its practical nature, a physical representation of their decision to share not just a home but the most private space within it. "I'll finish the bed tomorrow," Ryan said as they surveyed the room's new configuration. "Tonight you can still have the original bed." "Thank you," Sharon said, though she found herself wondering what it would be like when both beds were occupied, when she would fall asleep and wake up in the same room as this man who had become so important to her in such a short time. That night, Sharon lay awake listening to the sounds of Ryan preparing for sleep in the main room. Soon those sounds would be coming from just a few feet away, separated only by the small space between two beds. The thought should have made her nervous, but instead it filled her with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. The next morning brought the completion of Ryan's carpentry project and the arrival of the first travelers to pass through since the storm. Sharon watched from the window as two men on horseback stopped to water their animals at Ryan's well, and she felt a familiar tension grip her stomach. "Strangers," she said unnecessarily. Ryan looked up from his work on the bed's final assembly. "Probably just passing through," he said, "but you don't have to go outside if you'd rather not." His understanding of her anxiety touched Sharon deeply. She had grown so accustomed to hiding from strangers that it had become instinctive, but Ryan's casual acceptance of her discomfort made her feel protected rather than pitied. "Maybe I should face them," she said, surprising herself. "I can't hide forever." "No pressure," Ryan said firmly, "but if you want to try, I'll be right there with you." The offer of his support gave Sharon the courage she needed. When the travelers knocked on the cabin door, she stood beside Ryan as he opened it, her scarred face visible to their scrutiny. The men, trappers by their appearance, showed the usual moment of shock when they saw her, but Ryan's calm presence seemed to moderate their reaction. They asked about trail conditions and accepted his directions with polite thanks, treating Sharon with the same courtesy they showed Ryan. "Much obliged," the older trapper said as they prepared to leave. "You folks have a good day." "You as well," Sharon replied, and she realized it was the first time in months she had spoken directly to a stranger without trying to hide her face. After the men left, Sharon felt a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. The encounter had been brief and relatively painless, but it had required all her courage to face it openly. "You did well," Ryan said quietly. "Took backbone to stand there and let them see you." "It wasn't as bad as I expected," Sharon admitted, "though I'm not sure I'm ready for larger groups yet." "No need to rush," Ryan assured her. "Courage builds gradually, like muscle. You push yourself a little further each time until what seemed impossible becomes manageable." His words reminded Sharon of her mother's approach to teaching difficult skills: patient, encouraging, focused on gradual improvement rather than immediate perfection. The comparison made her realize how much Ryan's teaching style resembled that of someone who truly cared about her development rather than someone who was simply trying to change her to suit his preferences. That evening, as they prepared for their first night sharing the bedroom, Sharon found herself thinking about the distance she had traveled, not just geographically, but emotionally and spiritually. A week ago, she had been a desperate woman convinced that her scars made her unworthy of love. Tonight, she was settling into a home where she was valued and respected, preparing to sleep in the same room as a man who saw her as a complete person rather than a collection of flaws. "Sharon," Ryan said as they both prepared for bed, maintaining careful privacy despite their shared space, "I want you to know that having you here, it's changed things for me. Made this place feel like a home instead of just a shelter." His words sent warmth flooding through her chest. "It's changed things for me too," she replied. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a whole person, rather than just a set of problems to be solved or avoided." "You're not a problem," Ryan said firmly. "You're a blessing I didn't know I needed." The declaration was so unexpected and so sincere that Sharon felt tears prick at her eyes. She had traveled 1,000 miles looking for someone who might accept her despite her flaws, and instead she had found someone who valued her because of who she was. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As they settled into their respective beds, Sharon marveled at how natural the arrangement felt. There was nothing awkward or uncomfortable about sharing the space with Ryan. Instead, his presence felt reassuring, a reminder that she was no longer facing the world alone. "Good night, Sharon," Ryan said softly in the darkness. "Good night, Ryan," she replied, and for the first time since the fire, she fell asleep feeling completely safe and utterly at peace. The weeks that followed established a rhythm of domestic partnership that felt both natural and profound. Sharon threw herself into the work of transforming Ryan's cabin into a true home, while Ryan began including her in decisions about the property and their shared future. They worked together on projects, shared meals and conversations, and gradually built the kind of trust that comes from daily proof of mutual respect and consideration. As winter gave way to the first hints of spring, Sharon found herself changing in ways that went far beyond her improved circumstances. The constant anxiety that had plagued her for 2 years began to fade, replaced by a confidence she had thought was lost forever. Her scars remained, but they no longer felt like the defining feature of her existence. One morning in early March, Sharon woke to find Ryan already up and working in his shop. She dressed and went to find him, carrying a cup of coffee as a peace offering for the early disturbance. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, settling on a stool beside his workbench. "Too many ideas," Ryan replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Been thinking about improvements to the cabin, additions we could make if we're planning to stay here long term." The casual use of "we" sent a thrill through Sharon's chest. Somewhere in the past weeks, they had stopped being a temporary arrangement and started being a partnership with a future. "What kind of improvements?" she asked. Ryan showed her sketches he had been working on, plans for expanding the cabin, adding a proper kitchen, creating separate spaces for different activities. The drawings revealed a vision of domestic life that was both practical and beautiful, designed for two people who intended to build something lasting together. "These are wonderful," Sharon said, studying the careful details, "but they represent a significant investment of time and materials. Are you certain you want to commit to that?" Ryan set down his coffee and turned to face her directly. "Sharon," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness that made her heart race, "I need to tell you something." The tone of his voice made Sharon's stomach clench with sudden fear. Had she misread the situation? Was he about to tell her that their arrangement wasn't working, that it was time for her to move on? "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," Ryan continued, "and I need you to know that having you here isn't just convenient for me. It's not just about the cooking and cleaning and mending." Sharon waited, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "The truth is," Ryan said, reaching out to take her hands in his, "I've fallen in love with you. Not despite your scars, not overlooking them, but including them as part of who you are. You're the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I've ever known, and I can't imagine my life without you in it." The declaration hit Sharon with the force of a revelation. She had been so focused on earning her place in Ryan's household that she hadn't allowed herself to recognize the deeper feelings that had been growing between them. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know it's complicated," he continued quickly. "I know you came here looking for something different. And I don't want to pressure you into anything you're not ready for. But I had to tell you how I feel." Sharon looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and hope. This man who had shown her such consistent kindness and respect was offering her something she had thought was impossible. Love that was based on who she truly was, rather than what she looked like. "I love you too," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I think I have for weeks, but I was too afraid to believe it could be real." Ryan's face transformed with relief and joy. "It's real," he assured her, lifting her hands to his lips and pressing gentle kisses to her scarred fingers. "More real than anything I've ever felt." As he drew her into his arms, Sharon felt the last of her defenses crumble. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to be completely vulnerable with another person, to trust that she was loved not in spite of her imperfections, but because of the complete person she was. "Beautiful," Ryan murmured against her hair, and Sharon knew he meant it in every sense of the word. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, in the small church in town with half the community in attendance. Sharon worried about the reactions of the townspeople, but Ryan's quiet confidence and obvious devotion to her seemed to override their initial prejudices. By the time they spoke their vows, even the men who had rejected her so cruelly months earlier were nodding their approval. As they stood before the altar, Sharon caught sight of her reflection in the church's stained glass windows. The colored light fell across her face, illuminating both her scars and her unmarked skin with equal beauty. For the first time in years, she saw herself as Ryan saw her, not as a damaged woman trying to hide her flaws, but as a complete person worthy of love and respect. "Do you, Sharon Clark, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the minister asked. "I do," Sharon replied, her voice strong and clear. "Do you, Ryan Lee, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Ryan said, his eyes never leaving Sharon's face. As they kissed to seal their union, Sharon felt a transformation that went deeper than legal documents or public ceremonies. She had found not just a husband, but a partner who saw her true worth and a home where she could be completely herself. The reception was held in the cabin they now officially shared, with neighbors bringing food and music to celebrate their union. As the evening progressed, Sharon found herself laughing and talking with people who had once shunned her, accepted now not because her appearance had changed, but because Ryan's love had given her the confidence to claim her rightful place in the community. Late that night, after the last guest had departed, Sharon and Ryan stood together on their porch looking out over the moonlit mountains. The spring air was soft and sweet, carrying the promise of new growth and fresh possibilities. "Any regrets?" Ryan asked, his arm around her waist. Sharon considered the question seriously. The path that had brought her to this moment had been painful and difficult, marked by rejection and despair. But it had also led her to a love deeper and truer than anything she had imagined possible. "None," she said firmly. "Every step of the journey was worth it to end up here, with you." Ryan pulled her closer, and Sharon marveled at how perfectly she fit against his side. They had both been broken by life's cruelties, but together they had found a way to heal and grow stronger. "I used to think my scars were a curse," Sharon said quietly. "Now I think they might have been a blessing in disguise." "How so?" "They kept me from settling for less than I deserved. If I hadn't been scarred, I might have married James and never known what real love felt like. I might have spent my whole life with someone who loved me conditionally, never knowing there was a man out there who could love me completely." Ryan turned to face her, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "You are beautiful," he said, tracing the lines of her scars with gentle fingers. "Every part of you, every experience that made you who you are. I wouldn't change a single thing about you." As he kissed her again, Sharon felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. She had found her home, her partner, and most importantly, herself. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Colorado territory, broken and desperate, had been transformed into a woman who knew her own worth and claimed her rightful place in the world. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, vast and beautiful and full of promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but Sharon would face them with Ryan at her side in the unshakable knowledge that she was loved exactly as she was. In the distance, a wolf howled at the moon, its voice carrying across the peaks and valleys with wild, untamed beauty. Sharon smiled at the sound, recognizing in it something of her own journey from pain to healing, from isolation to love. Like the wolf, she had found her voice again, and she would never be silent about her own worth. The scarred mail-order bride had become a beloved wife, not through any change in her appearance, but through the transformative power of love that saw beyond surface imperfections to the beautiful soul beneath. And in finding that love, she had discovered that true beauty had nothing to do with unmarked skin and everything to do with the courage to be authentically, completely, unapologetically herself.